and sometimes your conclusion, or your conclusion is going to be really rushed, and you won't be able to get to say all the things. So this is a really deadly mistake that you can make when you're doing in your case competition. Now, why does this happen? So, well, I'll try to talk a little bit about why I think this happens in terms of my personal experience and what I've seen from coaching teams. First of all, is if you're just starting off and doing case analysis and you're doing presentations, you probably don't. If you don't have a presentation structure, it's really easy to get lost in your content and then run out of time. So, not having a case structure and not having a presentation structure is a common cause of running out of time, or having too many slides and too much content, which is a little bit related to the lack of structure. So what are the solutions to some of this? Well, you want to use a presentation structure of some sort, and I'll go into this a little bit later on. And keep introductions and other types of keep introductions short. If you're introducing your team, don't spend a lot of time introducing the team and saying that this is the marketing specialist and this is the finance specialist. It's cute, but frankly, spending a lot of time introducing your team doesn't add anything to the content and doesn't give you any points. Oh, and by the way, if you have questions, do feel free to input them into the chat along the way. And I'll pause at certain points in time in the presentation, and then you can, and I'll try to answer the questions that have been put into the chat. So that's number 3. So and then how else do you want to avoid this? Well, you want to create and practice contingency plans to skip your content. You always want to have somebody who's keeping time in your team and paying attention. And then in the event that it's looking like you're running over time, have some hand signals, like this to say that you need to move on. But the key thing is that each person needs to know what they can and can't skip. There are certain things that you really do not want to skip, such as you don't want to skip your implementation plan, your timeline, or your impacts. Because if you skip those, well, it's really hard for the judges to score you on the implementation timeline and the implementation plan. So that was number 3 in terms of running out of time. Number 2, not answering the question. I see this quite a lot also, especially if the case is a little bit difficult. We see teams up there, they make great presentations, and then you get the Q&A, and then you ask them, it's like, well, okay, so the case asks you about this question. What's your answer? And then you can see the team look at them and go, oh my goodness, we really didn't think about that, or we completely forgot about that. So that's kind of number 2 in terms of what I say is a deadly mistake. It also happens quite often, especially, like I said, especially as you start just beginning to do this. Sometimes you'll get great discussions with your team and they say, oh yeah, that's a great solution. And then you'll get so focused on your solution that you forget you've got to answer the question. So what happens? Well, sometimes this happens when you divide up responsibilities too early. Some teams will very early on in their preparation divide up the responsibilities. Say, okay, you do this slide, you do that slide, you do that slide, and you do that slide. But then no one looks at it overall and then says, hey, wait, are we answering the question? So that's one of the reasons why you sometimes will forget to answer the question. Another thing is getting too excited about your solution. Like I said, sometimes the teams will come up with discuss a great solution, and then when you get around as you're doing this, you kind of forget that it's not answering the question. So I moved the subtitles to the bottom because I realized it's covering up the heading. So how do we avoid this? Well, the way to avoid this is make sure you're agreeing on your solution jointly before starting individual work. When you're working together as a team, there are a couple of workshop videos in the ACRC learning resources that will talk about working together as a team and preparing. When you're working together as a team, you want to spend a certain amount of time jointly discussing the problem, the solution, and making sure everyone is headed in the same direction before you split off and do your individual work. So again, there's another point, use a set presentation structure to make sure that you have a slide in there that talks about how you're going to answer the question. And then, of course, check back with the case problem and make sure that your solutions are answering the case problem. So that's number 2 in terms of deadly mistakes, in terms of not answering the question. Now, so in number 1, the number 1 deadly mistake that I've seen in case competition and case analysis is identifying the problem incorrectly. Uh, this will happen occasionally, where teams will go up and present, and as a judge, I've sat there and said, wait, what problem are they solving? And you realize like, wait, did they misunderstand the case? Did they misunderstand the problem in the case? And you go, oh gosh, how do what do I ask them in Q&A? What do I talk what do I talk to them about? As a judge, do I say to them, why did you think the question was X? Doesn't the case say Y? So, um, this, yeah, I've seen this happen quite a few times. And as a judge, it feels like, well, you don't really know what to do. Do you want to be nice to them and kind of just ask them some questions, or do you want to point it out to them? Sometimes as a judge, you're a little bit torn in terms of what to do. Now, why does this happen? So, I think it happens in some cases, it's the fault of the case. There are cases that I've read that where the case question is really unclear, or there are a lot of questions that are posed in the case. Um, so sometimes the case is just written in a way that's confusing to people. Um, or, as a team, you misunderstood what the case question is saying. Now, this is particularly common errors if you're fairly new to case studies. As undergraduates, depending on your course of study, you may or may not have a lot of experience with business case studies. And of course, like I said, some of the business case studies are not necessarily written in a way that's conducive. Now, I have to say ACRC usually is pretty good about this. The ACRC cases usually don't have this problem. Um, so, and also, recently, I've seen this happen when teams rely on AI. If you are in participating in a competition that allows you to use AI or other research, AI will get it wrong. I've tried feeding some of these cases into, whether you want Gemini or Copilot or ChatGPT, and they have given absolutely the wrong answer for what the question is in the case. And I have seen some teams just copy and paste that and try to put in a presentation. And well, unfortunately, that meant that this is all wrong. So, if you're able to use AI, make sure you double check what the AI says against the case and what the case question says. So, some of the solutions to avoid this happening are to what? Read the case and specifically the first and last paragraph very carefully. And most cases will have the question in the first and last or last paragraph. Some cases, the first paragraph was only overview, but generally you can see that most cases, the last paragraph will give you the question that the company is trying to face. Everyone on a team should look for and agree on what the case questions are, again, before dividing up the work and going on into your own separate ways. And then, same with the before, make sure you check the solutions against the problem and explain why it solves the problem. Because if you look at the solutions and you say, wait, hold on, what problem are you answering again? Then that will help make sure that you're checking against the solutions and making sure you're identifying the problem correctly. So those are the top 3 mistakes that I've seen. And the reason why I say they're deadly is because these are mistakes that will really sink your presentation. If you do any of these things wrong, the chances of you scoring well in your competition are pretty slim. Because if you identify the problem incorrectly, well, you want to understand the scoring mechanism. The scoring mechanism for most competitions will have a problem identification, analysis and recommendations, implementation plan and feasibility, and your presentation style. So presentation style will only get you a portion of the points. If you get the question wrong, your whole recommendations, your implementation are probably going to be wrong. So getting the problem correct is really, really important. And you want to make sure that before you run off and each person puts together some great looking slides that you're getting the problem correctly. Then next, if you get the problem right, but then forget to answer it, or you don't create a very strong linkage between what your solution and the question, that also is another deadly mistake because as a judge, you kind of look at it and you say, well, the solutions seem kind of interesting, but I'm not quite sure how the solutions address the question. So, making sure that you answer the question is also really important to being able to at least, meet a certain benchmark in terms of the case competitions. And then, of course, not running out of time. So, if you run out of time, you're either rush through your end or you're not going to be able to get to some of the content that you wanted to. So, making sure that you pace yourself and you manage your time during the presentation is really important. And so that's what's going to get me to the next part, which is around how to avoid the mistakes. Um, but I guess before I start the next part, let me pause here and see if there are any questions. I don't see any in the chat, but I don't know if it's because it's not turned on or if it's just people are still absorbing what I'm saying. Okay, anything?
Oh, I think I would encourage everybody to ask questions, and especially that you should not be shy, right? You are the people who are trying to get into the competitions or already competing. So don't be shy, open your camera, ask a question, have
Yeah.
fun, learn more.
Okay, I see the question in the chat. Can you describe what are unclear case questions and can you suggest aspects of information that we should learn to identify? In some, I've seen some cases where they throw out like 4 or 5 questions in the case. Um, and then it becomes a question. Then it's really kind of unclear what the case is necessarily asking. Or in some situations, I've seen the case says a certain question in the first paragraph, but in the last paragraph says a different question. So I think this goes back to there's a point there's a point I should make around role, which I forgot to put in the slides, but this is the point where um, case studies and case study analysis is about putting yourself in the role of a consultant to the management, to the board, or to the senior management of the company. So, you know, think about it from their standpoint, from the company exec standpoint. This is they're facing some big business problem. So how do they solve it? So what is the problem that they are facing? And then what do you recommend them to do in terms of going about solving it? Um, so that's how you want to try to look at the thing. But like I said, the first and last paragraphs of the case usually will tell you um, what the question is. Also, um, it also helps to look for sentences that have a question mark at the end of it. That's usually a sign of it. Or you'll be phrasing like, now, whoever is wondering what they should do. That is the example of a case question. Um, So a couple other questions that people say, can the case contain multiple problems? I've seen cases that do have multiple problems, but what you want to try to do is you want to then try to wrap the questions up into what do these multiple problems mean? When it's talking about kind of a problem A, B, and C, they usually have a theme. There's some theme around it. Let's see. So the question around the perfect solution doesn't leave space for Q&A, which sometimes negatively affects marking. Um, I'm guessing what you're saying is that you've made it you've done a presentation at the end. There's no Q&A. There's no questions. Um, I've rarely come across that because that usually either means that the solution is so complete that it's amazing and you're definitely in first place, or there's the judges didn't find anything that they could ask you about, which is I've seen that before, but it usually means that there's been something wrong with the presentation. Um, if there's no questions, I'm not sure what you can do about it because um, it's Q&A kind of is the time for the judges to ask you questions. I mean, you could try to get the judges to ask you something. I'm not sure. It's a little bit. I'm not sure you can do a whole lot about the Q&A. So there's a question about, is the question usually explicitly shown or do we need to figure it out for ourselves? Um, Usually the case studies are written in a way where the question is pretty explicit. Again, like I said, in the first and last paragraphs, usually. Okay, there's a question around marking criteria. Each competition will have different marking criteria. So the HKU, the HSBC, HKU, ACRC competition, the marking criteria is on the website. It's important to look at the marking criteria before you go to competition to understand what the criteria are. But um, so let's see, is a marking criteria the percentage breakdown, presenting styles and organ. Um, in business case competitions, presenting style and organization is usually not a particular key aspect because business case studies are about the analysis and the recommendations. It's a little bit different from other speaking events where presentation style is a bit more important. Following structure. So yep. So I'll talk about structures next, which is my section about how to avoid mistakes. And if you generally don't know the answer to a particular question, how do we handle the minimized damage? Well, this is what I'm talking about. This is a great segue into my next section, which is how to avoid the mistakes. So sometimes, yes, you will come across things that you look at and you say, wow, this is really difficult. I don't know what to do. So in that case, this is what I kind of coach the teams on in terms of how to go about doing things because the students I coach usually don't have very much experience with business case studies. Oftentimes, their participation in our internal competition is the first time they're being exposed to business case studies. So I really have to teach them from the ground up in terms of how do you read a case and everything. So what I talk about is structure and tools. So structure, presentation structure. There's some really good resources in the ACRC website. If you look under learning resources, I have the link later on in my presentation. But in terms of presentation structure, this is what I tell teams in terms of business presentations. Always start with the end in mind. And you want to take the judge with you on the journey. The journey it should be a journey of you convincing them that your solution is the best. So how do you do this? Let me give you an example. HSBC, HKU, ACRC competition, 20 minutes presentation time. That means in terms of your slides, you really can't do more than 15 to 18 speaking slides. As you may have noticed, I speak quite quickly. So I can probably get through about 18 slides in 20 minutes. I don't really recommend that you try to do that. I really try to keep teams for 20-minute presentation. I'll really try to do things around, try to keep teams at around 15 slides or so. What does this mean? Well, it means that some of the more detailed things, such as your analysis, can go in an appendix. Now, why can it go in an appendix? Because during Q&A, you will have the opportunity to pull it up. If a judge says, well, how did you reach that conclusion? You can say, well, let me take you to an analysis here in our appendix. This is how we went through this. Or how do you come up with that number? You say, oh yes, so our calculations are here in the appendix. This is how you do this. Now, because you have to only have 20 minutes, so every slide, and there's limited number of slides, every slide needs a really key message and answer the so what question. Right? You need to be able to answer, why are you telling the judges this? How is it important? And then in your presentation, your analysis and recommendations do most of the presentation. So you're still saying, okay, well, this is all good, Alan, but what does this really mean? So here it is. So two structures that I have commonly seen, one of which has been talked about many times during the previous year's workshops, is the scores structure. Start, challenges, options, recommendations, extras, and then summary. So if you look at the learning resources here, you'll see in the storylining, and I think in another workshop later on, they'll also talk about it. That's not necessarily very intuitive sometimes in terms of heading. So I tell my teams, you want to do overview, you want to talk about the problem, analysis, the solutions, implementation, and your conclusion. So those are structure. Those are kind of the structures. Really the same thing, but just different ways to call it. So here's an example of what it might look like. This is from some of the workshops. start, you can do it. You want to do an executive summary. If you can do a story, that's even better. Then you want to define the problem. You want to analyze the problem, present the alternatives, talk about your recommendations in terms of your the pillars of your solutions, how you can implement it, the impact of your solutions, and then risks and mitigants, and then the summary and the closing. So you want to keep most of your you want to spend most of your time in the middle part around the analysis, the alternatives, and the implementation. Because the rest, there's no scoring for most of the rest of it. There's no scoring on, how great of an executive summary you've done. There's no scoring in terms of there's no scoring in terms of your conclusion. But you want to be able to uh, focus the meat of your presentation and your content of it around the middle part. Now, one important thing to keep in mind, which is business style communication. I really do recommend watching some of the workshop videos because they'll talk about this kind of the pyramid, the pyramid, or in U.S. terms, they'll talk about BLUF, bottom line up front way of presenting. This is a standard business communication style, which is you state the conclusion first, and then you then talk about why. This is a little bit different from academic writing, which is you'll go through all your evidence and your analysis, and then et cetera, and then say what the conclusion is. The business style communication wants you to state the conclusion first. Now, there are a couple benefits for this. First of all, is that if you state your conclusion first, then it's easier for the judges to follow, right? They know where you're headed. It's the analogy I usually give to teams like this. I say, well, look, if you're going on vacation, do we start with saying I'm going to the airport? No, you start with saying, well, where am I going, right? You say, let's go. You don't say, let's go to the airport. You say, hey, I want to go to a vacation, somewhere, right? So that's kind of an example I give. So you don't want to tell people that you went to the airport, got on a plane, and then arrived somewhere. You want to tell, well, we're heading here, and here's how we can get there. So your analysis recommendations, 2 or 3 themes, often called pillars, your implementation plan, and your conclusion. So those are kind of this is the pretty standard structure that you'll see most of the advanced teams will utilize. Now, please don't everyone use the same headings around this, because if you do, I mean, the slides, the structure might look kind of boring, but this is generally an idea of what you want to have within your presentation. Okay, so let me stop here there because there have been a few more questions that have come through in the chat. Should we only write things broadly, or should we write the things broadly, or should we write only key parts? Well, it really depends on each slide, what you're trying to do. If you're in your analysis and your solutions, you really want to put in as much detail as is relevant. How should a group handle situations where members disagree on the interpretation of case questions? You will need, from a team dynamics standpoint, and these are kind of more advanced topics in terms of team dynamics. You will need a conflict resolution mechanism of some sort. Usually, the more successful ones I've seen is basically the team leader needs to make a call. Somebody's going to be a team leader, and they need to make a call to say, okay, what are we going to do? Because you could spend a lot of time discussing and debating, but at a certain time, you need to make a decision. What are we going to go with? So compromise is generally, I mean, there's one strategy sometimes that you can say, well, we'll try to throw everything at it because we're not sure what the question is. So we'll try to throw every solution at it. If you really don't know, you can try that as a strategy. If you really have no idea, just say, okay, we're really not sure what the question is or what the questions are, but here's our solutions, and we're gonna throw everything at it. And there's a question about how do we come up with numbers relevant to info is given on a case? Can we reference the web? Whether or not you reference the web depends on your case competition rules and how it's structured. Um, there are there are a couple of different ways to come up with numbers in a case. One is estimation. Um, if you want to you estimate, well, what is the market size? What is a per customer spend, and then multiply it. Um, and then so that's you want to do some sort of estimation. Please don't go into some really complicated analysis in terms of statistical spreads. In most of these business case competitions, you just don't have enough time to do this. Um, Somebody asked about an example of an excellent slide and analyzes. Yeah. I wouldn't say there's an example of excellent slides. It's going to be around, are there some really good presentations? I need to. I don't have any. I don't have any off the top of my head. But there's something let me think about. Because the slides are there to help you convey a message. Yeah, it's there to help you to explain things to a judge. So it's not there to be. It's not a product by itself. Okay, so that's okay. So the question around the data provided by case is not updated and different with data on the website. Which data should I use? Uh, Now this is a timing issue in terms of when the case takes place. Um, Now it depends on how the question it depends on what the question is in the case. I give the example I usually give is this. Now, if you get a case study around Cathay Pacific pre-COVID, do you pretend you don't know COVID happened and tell them that they should do international expansion, or do you kind of say, oh well, COVID's going to happen, what do we do? It's kind of it. If unfortunately if you get a case like this, I think the best way to go about it is to say, look, um, the numbers from a case from this time were X. We can see from the most recent numbers that they look like Y. But the main point is, what do the numbers mean? What is what is how is it relevant to your solution? This is not a point around which numbers are right. It's about what numbers are relevant. But if you're in a competition where you can look at external data, what I'd say is this: your competitors are likely to be using the external data, so it's better that if you have looked at the external data and the more updated data, you should say that you've done so, rather than sticking to the case itself, because otherwise you look like other teams did more work and you didn't, which if you did more work is kind of unfortunate. Okay, so that was the part about presentation structures. Now, next, let me talk a little bit about some less deadly but also common mistakes that I've seen. Like I said, these are mistakes that I think I've seen quite a few teams quite a few teams will make these mistakes, and so hopefully by sharing some of this, you can avoid some of these going down some of these roads. So I'm gonna go in terms of the structure of the presentation, in terms of how I usually will expect to structure the presentation. Oh, but actually, before I do that, let me talk about a section I don't have, which is around roles. Sometimes I will see teams that will go up and say, we are here today to do a case analysis. And the case study says X and the case study says Y. And so we analyze the case study and we think we should do Z. Okay, so this is the point I said around roles. Your role in a case study analysis is the consultant to the management, right? So try to avoid talking about the case study, and pretend you're talking to the executives of the company. The ACRC competition is quite interesting because sometimes you do actually get the opportunity. Remember last year's competition, the case study on De Beers, one of the judges was actually an exec from De Beers. So that was kind of interesting. Unfortunate for the teams because it kind of meant that many of the solutions were subject to probably a lot more scrutiny than they otherwise would have been. But yeah, common mistakes in the opening introduction. Um, okay, giving too long of an introduction. Like I said at the beginning, it's kind of cute to introduce your team members as the marketing specialist and the finance specialist and HR specialist and et cetera, et cetera. But it's a bit unnecessary and it doesn't do anything to your presentation. Keep your introductions on your team short. Um, a story. There, I've seen teams do, a bit of a skit, which was quite entertaining. Um, but then I said, wait, that was quite entertaining, but what does that have to do with the case? And unfortunately, that kind of caused me to lose attention because I was thinking, well, wait, what does that skit have to do with the case? It was kind of entertaining, but I'm not sure where they're going with this, which resulted in me kind of missing out on the next 30 seconds of whatever they're going to say. So if you're going to do a story, make sure it's relevant. Make sure there's a clear link to the case. Try to avoid these kind of these skits or these plays that don't really link to the case. Sometimes I see teams that will repeat lots of background from a case, basically, summarizing the case. Uh, Judges should have read the case. So please do not spend a lot of time repeating the case because judges will listen to 4 or 5 teams. It's really boring as a judge to hear about the content you've read in the case. It's like, well, okay, look, we're judges. We can read. Thank you for showing that you can read too, but you really don't need to summarize. Now, if there's some really key points that you think are important, it's worth highlighting, but don't summarize the whole thing. So some tips. In terms of structure, do a quick team intro. Introduce the team. You say which university you're from and the names of the team members, but then get right into the problem statement. Um, if you're the story type team, which is a more advanced topic, if you manage to get to a point where you have a team member who can start the presentation with a engaging story, do the engaging story, then do a quick team intro and then get into the problem statement. The purpose, because always, like I said, every slide needs to have a purpose and a so what. The purpose of an introduction opening slide is to set the scene for the judges, to make sure the judges are focusing on you, paying attention to what the problem you're going to talk about is, and thinking about your solution. That's the purpose of opening an introduction. Okay, so next section would be the problem definition. So what do I see as common mistakes in problem definition? Well, as I already said, not identifying the stated problem. Only looking at the stated problem, I don't know if on purpose or not. Sometimes I've seen cases where I look at the problem that's written, I look at the case in the company, and I say, okay, the company says that their problem is X, but actually they have a much bigger problem there. So this will set apart kind of the more basic teams from more advanced teams. The more advanced teams, when they start doing the analysis, might realize like, wait, that's not a problem. The problem's over there. So you want to check to see if there are other problems. But on the other hand, if you go too far into other problems, but don't link them back to the state of the problem, that's also an issue. Sometimes I've seen teams that go about and say, we think the problem is X. It's like, wait, what does that have to do with the problem stated in the case? I don't understand, right? The problem in the case is this. You said it's this, but you haven't linked them. So a good structure to do is say the stated problem is this. Based on our analysis, we think the underlying problem is this. And so what we're going to show you today is how we address both of these problems. So yeah. To avoid this is, again, using a structure, create a slide with the stated problem, summarize the problem, in a few words, and then, consider whether there are underlying problems that are causing it. Um, you know, why is this? I mean, why is the stated problem the problem? And is this the biggest problem the company is facing? Now, let me give you an example. I can't remember which case this was, but there's a case I remember reading where the company was interested in doing international expansion. But then when you looked at how much market share they had in their home market, it was tiny. They had like 1% market share. And it's like, wait, hold on, this company's not even and they weren't profitable either. I was like, wait, this company's not even profitable in the home market, and they're thinking international expansion. That's completely the wrong problem. Right? You need to be. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to that you're if you're unprofitable in your home market, that if you go into a new market, you'll suddenly become profitable. It's very. I don't know if I've seen any company where that's possible. So if a company's not profitable and they're talking about international expansion, they need to solve the profitability problem first. You know, if a company is talking about their labor costs being high, but actually they have a big fixed cost problem, well, they have to solve the fixed cost problem first. So, looking at the problem and thinking critically about whether or not there's some underlying or other problems is important. Okay, so then moving on to analysis. So you've gotten past the problem statement. You're getting into your analysis. You say, yeah, we're getting really rolling on this. And then what do? Well, if you relied on AI, like I said, and didn't check against the case, um, the general purpose AI right now is not very good at doing some of these analyses. It oftentimes will get things wrong or even make things up. So, I mean, until somebody comes up with a case study AI, uh, make sure you double check what the AI says against the case and against real life. Again, analysis that a common mistake I see in analysis is repeating lots of case content. Please do not just put the graph from the appendix of the case study into your slide. All right, that doesn't show any analysis. I mean, if you want to do that, you need to make a pretty strong point. What does this show you? What does this show about the company? On the other hand, if you use information from outside sources but you don't explain, that also confuses the judges. Uh, in a recent competition, um, I had teams that were talking about this solution this product that the company had done. I was looking at the case and say, wait, the case doesn't say anything about this product. And then I go onto the company's website, and then yeah, it's there. Except the product was launched after the time frame of the case. The case took place in 2023. The products were launched in 2024. But all these teams were talking about the product that was not part of the case. So if you can talk about something that's not part of the case and that's something that the company has done since the case was written, make sure you're explaining where your information is from, and check the time when some of this stuff has taken place. And then, oh yeah, some some beginning teams will put up a SWOT and five forces. A SWOT and five forces usually does not tell you very much. So really, unless you really, really can't think of anything else, please do not put a SWOT or five forces onto the slide for your analysis. That's just it's not very interesting. And then sometimes they forget a so what. Sometimes you forget a so what. You get really excited in doing all the analysis, and you say, "Well, here's all this data," um, but you kind of forget to link it back to the problem or your solutions. So you need to make sure that if you've done the analysis, you can always hit at the very end of every slide. You need to say, and so this is what it means for a solution, and this is how it helps the company, and this is how it solves the problem. Every slide needs to have that as an ending. Okay, so yep, there's a question about some tips on conducting analysis, so I'm getting to that right now. So, choose some relevant and meaningful analysis tools. Here are some of the ones that I recommend that teams use. Competitive landscape, basic comparison. Who are the competitors in the industry or in the field that you're analyzing? What are their relative strengths and weaknesses? Because that way you can kind of know where does your company rank relative to the competition. What is your company strong with that relative to other the companies. A slightly more advanced version of that is a VRIO matrix. Valuable, rare, inimitable, and organized. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to do the complete VRIO analysis, especially because The R, the rare, and the inimitable seem really similar, and the organized is really confusing. So I don't necessarily recommend spending a whole lot of time on VRIO, but it does it does give you a way of thinking about the competitive positioning of a company. In terms of strategic options, you can use an Ansoff matrix. So all of these things are common business analysis tools. You just look them up. Ansoff matrix looks at, do you do new products? Do you do new markets? Do you do existing products, or do the existing customers? So showing that kind of matrix in terms of how you might consider things is useful in explaining to the judges why you chose a certain thing. Because like I said before, um, one of the cases is like the company's thinking about international expansion, but they don't have their home market they don't have a solid footing in the home market yet. So actually the answer is they need to they need to focus on their home market first. And then you can use something like an Ansoff matrix to show that. Where they could spend a lot of resources in trying to do a new product for a new market, but they're better off served kind of making sure their product and service is mature for the existing market. International expansion. International expansion is a pretty common case question. Two tools that you can use are the cage distance and pestle. I don't like pestle quite so much because I think that's a little bit more ESG or ESG focused. But cage is very good in terms of making you think about, how alike is this market. An example I give is South America. Um, so if you're not familiar with South America, it's a pretty big place. Um, Now, it might all seem to be kind of similar, but the reality is that um, the markets there, while most of them speak Spanish, Brazil doesn't. Brazil speaks Portuguese, and the markets are pretty different. There's some really big markets and some really small markets, and the dynamics of each market are really different. So on the surface of it, you might say, "Oh yeah, South America is almost all Spanish speaking. We'll do one product and then we'll sell it all over the place." But the Spanish they speak is all slightly different. I worked in Mexico before. Argentinians speak, pretty different Spanish to Mexicans. So if you use Mexican phrasing for product in Argentina, it might not work so well. So these are some of the things that um, if you do a cage analysis, it'll show up a little bit. Well, so there's a question about some of the whether or not the tools align with a SWOT. Well, the difference with a SWOT is a SWOT just looks at the company itself. Um, the the tools I put up here all compare the company with something else because they're usually with competitors. So the point here is what is the company going to do versus the competitors. Also, because the SWOT is kind of general, it doesn't necessarily get you to focus on the right areas. Okay. And like I said, always make sure you tie the analysis findings back to the problem. This is how then this shows X. This shows why you do this solution. This shows why your answer is correct. This shows why our recommendation is the right one. Okay, so getting to recommendations then. What do we see in common mistakes? Too many solutions. Sometimes I see teams come up and say, "Oh, these are 5 solutions." I was like, "Oh gosh, are you able to get through all of them?" Wow. So too many solutions. Um, or not linking the solutions to the problem. It's confusing for the judge. You say, "Okay, that's an interesting solution, but I don't quite see how that addresses the question." Or unrealistic or boring solutions. I'll give you some examples of that. Or mixing up solutions with implementation. I've seen that happen recently also. Um, I said, wait, hold on. Why do you want to? Why do you want to do Why is model validation a solution? How does that solve the problem? And then after discussing with the team, they say, "Oh, yeah, no, our solution is that we need to develop a model." I said, "Look, yeah, so that's exactly it. The solution is your model. Model validation is just a step in that solution. So mixing up the solution with the implementation is something that I've seen. Um, so to avoid this is like if you have five or six solutions, you need to group them together. You need to say these are the main pillars of our solution, and then this is how it's going to work. Um, or if you really can't group them together in a logical way, put it in an appendix. And then so if you get a chance during Q&A, you can pull it up and say, hey, here's the other things we think about. Try to if you're able to give the pillars some inspiring names, such as well, don't call it a growth strategy. That's kind of boring. Call it something like rocket fuel, right? You want some imagery, and also it makes your presentation much more memorable. Um, it's if you say no, this is a rocket fuel strategy, the judges will remember that rather than that team that had the growth strategy. I'm serious because after you've watched four or five presentations on the same topic, unless you've taken really detailed notes, it all starts looking the same. So using inspiring and entertaining names for your solutions will help you stand out in terms of a presentation. Um, yeah, avoid boring or unrealistic solutions. So yeah, this is the second time I'm saying this. So what are some of these? Number one, okay, my animation is a little bit off, but anyway. So yeah, please do not suggest training as a core recommendation solution. Oh, so by the way, my background to this is that as a business exec or as a kind of corporate employee, these are things I'll look at and say, okay, that's kind of cute, but as an undergraduate, I might have done the same thing. But let me just tell you, from a corporate employee or exec standpoint, and these solutions just really don't seem realistic. So training just doesn't seem realistic. Why? Unless a company is completely clueless about what they're doing, they're already doing training. So more training probably isn't going to help. Um, Large scale IT systems. Yep. Sometimes we see some teams come up and say, oh yeah, the solution to this is that you should implement Oracle or SAP. Okay. Well, again, unless the company has no idea what they're doing, they probably looked at Oracle and SAP and they made a decision not to use it. Why? Well, because a lot of Oracle and SAP implementations fail. Um, and they fail pretty miserably after spending a lot of money. So it's kind of unrealistic as a solution and also kind of boring. M&A, haven't seen so much of that recently because I guess it's large scale M&A has become less common. But yeah, M&A as a solution doesn't usually solve the problem. Um, the small caveat I have to this is that M&A, if you see tech companies when they do M&A, they're usually doing this for a specific capability now. So that makes some sense. If your company is lacking in a specific capability and there's somebody out there that does have that capability, M&A might make sense. But M&A to solve a problem probably doesn't. And the main reason is because efficiencies of scale almost never materialize in real life. Organizational reorganization. Yeah, I couldn't think of a better way to write this, but restructuring the organization, having the sales team report to somebody different, or having the HR team report to somebody else, changing the structure of people doesn't really help things. It's unlikely to solve the problem. And then sometimes we see some teams suggest, oh, we should do a partnership with the government or change it to the laws. Kind of cute, but if you think about how long it takes to change some of the laws in your countries, it probably takes too long and it's too difficult. It's unlikely that uh, the companies that you're looking at are going to be able to do that in a reasonable time frame. Okay, so and then AI. Yeah, in the past 2 years, we see AI as a solution more and more. It's unrealistic and kind of boring, right? AI itself doesn't really solve anything. What are you going to feed the AI? How are you going to use the outputs? That's the key, right? So some better solutions. Okay, I do have to say this is what I always say to teams is this. As undergraduates, without any kind of real life experience in the workplace, it's usually kind of difficult to come up with more interesting solutions. So the best you can do is to look at examples from real life. What have you seen other companies do? What have you seen um, around? Because it's more interesting, it's more realistic, and it's ultimately more convincing as a solution. Another way to look at it is, put yourself in the customer's shoes. If you were the target customer, what do you want or need? What could the company do that addresses your need? Okay. There are a couple of questions about recording. Uh, I know this is being recorded, and from what I understand, these will be put up on the ACRC website. So I think you'll be able to find that on the website later on. Okay, so moving on into the implementation impact section in terms of common mistakes. Um, so I'm gonna say a series of things that might sound slightly contradictory, but I'm gonna say them and then try to explain why I think it is. So implementation plan. You've gotten through the analysis and recommendations, and you're kind of saying, well, here's the implementation plan, and then you kind of say, and we're gonna do everything in 3 months. I've seen teams do that. Um, and you look at it and say, really, everything in 3 months? That's just not realistic. So too short of an implementation, is not realistic. Um, or then you see the other side. Everything is going to take over the first thing that you do is going to take over 2 years, and the whole thing is going to take five. Well, most of the companies you're going to look at don't have that much time or resources to be able to last that long. So can't be too short, can't be too long. Or in terms of impact, too small. Sometimes the team's like, oh, we're going to acquire 100 customers in the first year. Okay, I'm sorry, but your market's like 1 million customers. So is 100 customers even meaningful? Or you say, oh yeah, we're going to do $1 million of revenue. Now, again, I have to say, as undergraduates, $1 million might mean a lot, but from a corporate standpoint, $1 million usually doesn't mean very much, especially in kind of Western economies. $1 million of revenue won't pay for your engineer. So, um, otherwise, or being too big. Uh, Sometimes we see some teams that say we're gonna grow at 500% in the first year. And then you look back at the data and you say, wait, it took them 5 years to get to this stage. How do you suddenly get 500% growth in the first year? Um, so yeah, so as expected, there are a lot of questions are coming up now in terms of, well, okay, if it's too short or too long, then what, or how do we do something in between, or how do we come up with numbers that aren't too small or too big? Yep, very good. I actually spend uh, a whole session with my teams around how to do estimation. So I'm not going to be able to do this here. Um, I'm not sure if there's. I mean, you can look in the workshop resources to see if there's anything around kind of market sizing. But there are a couple of different frameworks that you can use. Um, so timing wise, always want to give a mix of different things in implementation. You want to do you want to do something like this. What are the things that you're going to do right away? Right? Things that you can get started that you can be able to implement right away. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do that's gonna take 3 to 6 months, which is basically the preparation for whatever that you need to do. And then in 1 year, you want to be able to grow in a meaningful way. And then in years 2 and 3, you want to grow some more. Usually what I want to say. Um, and teams will usually ask me, well, then what about beyond 3 years? Most companies cannot accurately plan beyond 3 years. Very, very rare for companies to be able to do so in real life. You can try to do it if your case has the information for it, but I mean, you could just kind of draw an arrow that kind of goes out past 3 years. Is kind of the way I tell teams to kind of cheat on this. Occasionally, you will get judges that will ask you, what are you gonna do beyond 3 years? But that's kind of rare. Um, so the impact wise, well, so how do you know if the number is realistic? Well, first of all, check against history. How long did it take the company to get to its current size? How many customers do they acquire per year now? Right? If they acquire 1,000 customers per year, um, 1,500 seems pretty realistic. 2,000 seems, manageable. They acquire 1,000 customers a year and suddenly you can say we're gonna do 10,000 next year, hmm. Well, then you need to check against the other thing. How big is the market? If you say if the market is 1 million, if the market's 1 million customers, then maybe if you really change things, but if the market is only 20,000, you need at least 10% from an established company. If you're a new company, then actually you should be looking at multiples of growth. If startups, if you're a startup with like 100 customers, then you really should be looking at growing, 500 for next year, something like that. Okay, now we're getting further along, closer to the end. Risks and mitigants. Yeah. So sometimes you see a very generic list of risks. If you look at, again, this is difficult for undergraduates, frankly, difficult for professionals. Um, if you look up risks and mitigants in the project management standpoint, you'll get a very generic list of risks and mitigants. Running over budget, running out of time, no, please don't do that, right? The biggest risks in the case studies are going to be a change in regulation, your competitor is copying you, or you running out of money are probably the biggest risks. That's just off the top of my head. So, you always want to be prepared for the question, what do you do if your competitors copy you? You know, that's usually going to be a common question from the judges. Um, oh, sorry, I kind of didn't finish that slide. So, yeah, I didn't finish. So, uh, risk and mitigants. So yeah, how do you solve this? Yeah, like I said, you want to be able to make sure you're able to answer the question at least. So you have this great idea. What do you do if your competitors copy you? What do you do if your key employees leave or something like that? You think a little bit about what you do in this. And Q&A. So you finally gotten to the end of your presentation. Now you're handling Q&A. So what I see go wrong, because Q&A is a section that's often scored in case competitions. The handling of Q&A is a section that's scored. So what I see sometimes, changing your answer during Q&A. Depending on the type of judge you'll get, I've seen this happen a couple of different ways. One is a judge misunderstands the case your your answer, and then says, "Wait, the the case says X, so shouldn't you say Y instead?" Um, and then on the spot, you're very tempted to agree with the judge and say, "Oh yeah, yeah, that's right. We should change our answer." Really, don't do that. You spent hours analyzing the case. Unless you really miss something, do not change your answer or your strategy during Q&A. Because sometimes you will get a judge that's just testing you. They're just seeing how you will react to this. Actually, in the case, it's something else. So don't change your strategy, your answer to the question in Q&A. Don't make up an answer. Again, uh, uh, sometimes you ask a really difficult question and then not give up until you admitted you didn't know. He just keep drilling. Now, what does this do? If you try to keep making up answers, he just keep drilling. But what the result is that would just waste your Q&A time. So don't fall into that trap. Don't make up an answer. Or another thing that we see sometimes see is adding or contradicting your teammate. Um, one of the team members answers, and another team member jumps in and tries to add to it. Um, don't do that. As a judge, it just seems like you know as a team you're not working together very well. Unless your teammate completely misunderstood the question, what you should do is that just leave it. So don't change your approach. If you don't know you didn't consider it, just admit it. Why? If you admit you didn't do it, that's the end of the question, right? Then you move on to the next question. Unless it's something really obvious that you should have done, admitting that you didn't do it just allows them to move on to the next question. Trying to make up an answer just get you stuck on that question. And when your teammate is answering, everyone else should be looking at them and nodding and smiling. Nod and smile. It's actually probably the answer to a lot of things in life. Look at your teammate and nod and smile in agreement. Don't frown. don't don't look concerned, right? Look at them and nod and smile. That was a tip that my coach gave me when I was in the case competition team. So I've gone through a lot about kind of the mistakes, and so hopefully you learned something about how to avoid these things. Now, so maybe asking is okay, yeah, sure. Now you told me about um, all the mistakes, but how do I actually win the competition? So, well, winning the competition is going to be a combination of a couple of things. One is a little bit of luck in terms of who your competitors are and who your judges are and what their preferences are. By the end of the day, it comes down to who has a more convincing story. And the way you do a convincing story, in my view, is this: you want to start off, and I said because you want to take the judges on a journey. You want to start a journey off. Um, you 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 want to start off. You want to start the journey off by saying, okay, so this is the problem that we're going to solve, that we're going to discuss today. This is what the problem. This is the problem the company is facing. So these are based on our analysis. This is what's causing the problem. These are opportunities for a company that the company can pursue. These recommendations are how we will solve the problem for the company. This is what we will do in terms of the solution, and this is the impact that the solution will have. I forgot to put in the conclusion, but then the conclusion should be, and this is why our solution is the best, and this is how that will solve the problem for the company. So that's basically and bring the judges along on the roadmap. So that's brings me to the end of my content. For some other Q&A. Okay, so there's a question about how to approach the number of finances from the case. There will be different types of cases and varying amounts of numbers and finances. It depends a lot on your competition that you're in. Because some competitions, if you don't have access to Excel, you can only do some basic calculations. But though for a competition, if there's some financial numbers in the case, I recommend looking at a couple of things. What is the profit margin of the company? Do they have high fixed cost or high variable cost? Um, what is the cost per customer in terms of acquisition cost per customer? How much revenue do they make per customer? Because those are usually some basic numbers that will help you later on in terms of assessing your impact. You know, because then you want to say, well, if I acquire 10,000 customers, because you want to check, like I said, is 10,000 a right number or not? If you acquire 10,000 customers that only give you $10, that give you $10 a month, that's $100,000 in revenue per month. That's, times 12 months, that's 1.2 million US dollars per year. Is that enough to make your business viable? Depending on how much fixed costs you have, maybe, maybe not. Um, so that's how I usually will approach the numbers and the finances. So the question about the teammate answer the question wrong or misses a key point connecting factor. Unless they completely answered the wrong question, I really recommend not adding to the teammate's question, to the teammate's answer, because like I said, it makes it seem like you are disagreeing with your teammate. And so I personally generally do not recommend adding to an answer in Q&A. So somebody asked around taking about my question around taking judges on a journey. Um, what I'm trying to convey with that is that you want to, yeah, you do want to show them, you do want to show a roadmap for how the presentation is going to be. So I didn't cover it here, but in training for teams, I cover in terms of at the bottom of the slide, as I asked the teams to put a presentation roadmap, to show which section you're at in each part of the presentation, the overview, the problem, the analysis, the recommendations, pillar one, pillar two, and then etc. Um, but you always want to have an executive summary, which will basically say in 2 minutes what you're going to do. So that's the very, very start of your presentation, the executive summary. So again, the question around finances, um, is that you, as part of your recommendations, you need to give an impact of some sort because you need to explain why it is that you're recommending something. Like I said, if you want to say, we're going to acquire 10,000 customers in the first year, you need to explain how that's relevant and meaningful. So that needs to be um, in your 10,000 customers and $1 million revenue needs to be in your main slide. Now, if there's a question about, well, how did you get to $1 million revenue, then that can be in the appendix. You don't need to walk the judges through. Oh, and here's how we got to $1 million, unless it's a very, very finance heavy um, case. Okay. Any other questions? So there's a question around the okay on each slide you show a picture. Well, would you in terms of how to doing the slides, would you put a bar at the bottom of the slides, little arrow, little chevrons, and then have a little triangle that points to the section that they're in. That helps. First of all, it helps if you're managing like physical slides. The HSBC ACRC competition uses physical slides, and having that little thing helps you manage so you don't get lost in the physical slides. It also helps the judges when sometimes they want to refer back to a point in your presentation. So question about tips on selecting teammates to join a competition. Um, it's helpful if your teammates all have a basic understanding of business cases um, and you know have taken some coursework in marketing or in finance or accounting. Um, if you have teammates with a mix of these different abilities and backgrounds, it will make you much more likely to succeed because you'll be able to draw on each of their experience areas. How important are drawings and colors of aesthetics? Overall aesthetics of the presentation are probably a little bit more important, mainly because on a relative basis, your competition will have had the time to spend um, to make good slides. If you are in a time limited competition, like where you were given 3 or 4 hours to prepare, well, everyone's going to be in roughly the same situation. Um, so if you can have some basic diagrams, like some relationship diagrams, like how does this translate into that, that will make you stand out. So it's all kind of relative in terms of relative to the competition. What will the competition be able to do versus you? Because like I said before, you want to be more convincing, and the way you're more convincing is that is one of the ways you're more convincing is that you're able to structure your information in a way um, that is more clear or or is more clear for the judges to understand. How does joining case competition help with career building? Does it benefit on resume or only if you win? Um, let me. I'll put it this way because at least for the teams that I coach, I coach them using uh, um, common strategic analysis tools. Now, these are tools you use in strategic analysis outside of academics. And so, you know, showing that you understand how to look at a company strategy um, is an important is something that differentiates you from other people when you're going to an interview. Now, I do have to admit, I don't know how this works now with AI kind of screening of resumes. I really don't know how that might influence or not. But as a hiring manager myself, if I see somebody who's done case competitions, I kind of talk to them about, how do you do analysis, because um, AI will be able to do a lot of research, right? But then analysis is going to be the analysis skills are going to be much more important now because AI is going to be AI is already able to collect data and organize it much faster than we can. But but analyzing the data and making a determination of what that means and what you do is going to be a key, I think, on a key differentiator. Some strategy is reading the whole case efficiently. Yes, okay. Especially if English is if you're if the English ability of the team is not very, very strong, then the way I suggest reading cases is this. You want to first by identifying the problem, right? Because like I said, you need to make sure you agree on the problem and you know what problem you're solving before you get started on some of the work. So uh, everyone needs to read like the first two paragraphs and last two paragraphs quickly on time limit in the case, and to make sure, and then get together and say, okay, what do we think the problem is? Okay, is this a problem? Fine. Okay, then so who's going to look at which area of the problem? And then so you want to divide up the work amongst the team members. Um, teams that have not worked together very much or teams that are new to this will early on have everyone read the case and then come together and discuss. And then the teams have usually come back and said, okay, it took us 2 hours to read the case. How is this going to work when we have 3 or 4 hours to prepare? I was like, okay, yeah, it doesn't work that way. You need to be able to get the case read in 30 minutes. So this means, in some cases, skipping through some content. In some cases, dividing up the content areas among different team members. Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm sorry that I'm using my microphone, but it's quite hard for me to type on my phone right now.
No problem.
So this would be my last question because I know I've been asking a lot of questions. Um, but when it comes to coming up with solutions, right? Do you think it is more efficient for a person to work on each solution? Do you think, as in risk management, one person like seeks opportunity like different parts of the whole presentation or the speech, or do you think everyone should like gather together and brainstorm and come up with the whole solution implementation plan and stuff?
Okay. Yeah. So you're getting into some advanced topics around how you manage the division of work in the team. Um, Usually, the more successful teams I've seen have been like this. You need to spend, um, I think about 30 minutes. I mean, if you're doing it 3 or 4 hours, you need to spend about 30 minutes reading the case and agreeing on the problem. You need to agree high level what the pillars of the solution will be. What are the kind of as a team, what do you think are the key recommendations that you give to the company? are you going to do international expansion or not? Which countries are going to go into? And then what you do is then you start dividing them up amongst different team members to say, okay, well, so you just start doing the slide that talks about, the details about how we do this. I'm trying to remember what do I tell the teams? The recommendations, and then sometimes, and if there's some financials, then you have somebody who maybe will focus on the financial aspect of it to look at, what numbers will make sense. So it depends on a couple of things. One is what type of case it is, because if sometimes there are no numbers in the case. There are oftentimes cases that have no numbers in them, and so if you have somebody who does financials and you say, well, there are no numbers, what do I do? That sometimes is a little bit difficult. So you reallocate them to do something else. But otherwise, or in some case, or in other situations, I've seen that the case is such that you can't separate the financials from the recommendation, or it wouldn't work. So it depends on what type of case it is, and then also the relative capabilities of your team members. So understanding kind of the relative strengths and weaknesses of your team members is important, especially when it gets to Q&A, because in Q&A you want to have a team member assigned for each area to make sure that there's somebody who really understands each topic area and is able to answer the questions. Yeah. So yes, there's a key. So the key pillars can be discussed and should need to be discussed and agreed upon. But the details, especially if you're doing a case that where you can do outside research, the details around some of the out research or some of the supporting evidence can then be split up amongst different team members. But every team member should be familiar with the overall strategy and how it solves the problem, because occasionally you will have judges that pick on the weakest team member. I have seen that a couple of times, where the judge sees, oh, it's very clear this team member has spoken the least, and they're the most nervous about all of this. So during Q&A, I'm going to ask them a question and ask them to answer it. I've seen that happen a couple of times, including with my team last year. And sometimes that just happens. You just need to be able, so you need to make sure that everyone has at least a basic understanding of what the strategy and the solution is. Okay. Any other questions?
I think it's kind of time to wrap up.
Yeah. Yeah. So almost 8:30.
Yeah,
okay.
It's a very good session though.
Yeah.
Longer than we expected, but it's very long.
Yeah.
I would say I agree with almost everything that you have said.
Mm-hmm.
And I especially say almost, because all the judges are different. And you have to guys remember that there are 3 judges in our competition. So I will be speaking from the perspective of HSBC HKU competition. So the 3 judges have different approaches. They look at your answers from different perspectives, because you may have a finance person, HR person, and marketing person, and you never know what they want, right? So some are more keen on numbers, some are in your presentation when you prepare it and in advance predict how to approach all those different kinds of people. Some points that I liked that you mentioned, and I would like to just briefly highlight my opinion from the perspective of ACRC, Asia, our competition, right? Cases and misleading questions. So there are different schools of writing cases. So there are cases which have explicit question at the end of the case, and these are, I would call, easy. There are cases which have a hidden question within the case, which are more difficult. And I remember even one of my cases when I was writing them about Walmart. The case was basically based on mistakes that Walmart made when entering China. And then the students started explaining how these mistakes should be avoided, which was not the point of the case, right? So if you want to look for an example of misleading cases, yeah, this would be a good one. Another one was, question was, can the case have more than one question? And how you should answer it. So there was a case, again, Facebook against Tencent, or like comparative case with both companies. So some students at the competition approached it with only Tencent solution. Some of them approached it with only Facebook solution, and some of them approached it with Tencent and Facebook solution. So there was no right or wrong approach, but it all depends on how you have the presentation structured, prepared, how reasonable your answers are, and how you defend it. Right? Remember, this competition is with no internet access whatsoever. So the question about can we use outside data? No, because you don't have it. Basically, the case has all the data that you should be using, and you can make assumptions. If there is something that is not stated in the case, but you can make an assumption that you can justify to the judges who will ask you about numbers or assumptions, then you can use that. Remember, the slides are handwritten. So you asked about aesthetics of the slides. At least make it possible to read, because the judges are looking at it in real time. And if your handwriting is terrible and they cannot read it, they really have to focus on the handwriting, and then they cannot focus on your speaking, right? So there's this mismatch here. So you don't have to be a Picasso, you don't have to be an artist, but make it clear. And yes, I fully agree with the problem analysis. I think throughout the competition, this was the largest issue, that many teams did not analyze the case properly. And they had a brilliant answer to a question which didn't exist even. So Alan, thank you very much for coming. If you have one last sentence or two, please go on.
Yeah, I just I think it's great that all of you are interested in this, and I wish you best of luck in the competitions and in your future endeavors. I think the case analysis, like I said, is a very, very good practice for things that you will end up doing in your future careers, because it helps to demonstrate that you have the analysis and the presentation skills, and also your teamwork skills. And so whether you are in almost any role in the future, I think these are skills that are very, very valuable to develop. And I applaud all the students here for being so enthusiastic about this.
We actually did a survey, post-competition survey, KPMG, and what they discovered is that many students said that the 5 days at the finals of HSBC HK you're competing at the university. So you ask yourself whether it's worth it to join. Yes, it is.
Absolutely. So,
all right. Thank you everyone for coming. We will have the video on the website. So if you would like to revisit the ideas, just go to our website, maybe the end of the week, it will be up there. And of course, we welcome you to join the next workshop. The details are on the website as well, with another judge from HSBC. So hope to see you, I think it's on the 25th of February. Thank you very much. Give a big round of applause to Alan, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.